The weapon that fired itself again. A Han Dynasty frontier garrison, 130 BC. Commandant Zhao Feng had spent the better part of 2 decades defending the northern frontier against Xiongnu cavalry raids before the strange, heavy wooden device arrived at his garrison, carried on an ox cart from the capital, along with a terse official directive instructing him to test it, report on its effectiveness, and return his assessment before the following spring's campaigning season began in earnest. "They tell me," said Zhao Feng's chief weapons officer, a careful and technically minded veteran named Han Shu, turning the device over with evident and considerable curiosity, that this represents an entirely new approach to the crossbow, developed by workshops attached to the Imperial Armory, specifically intended to address the single greatest tactical limitation our frontier garrisons have faced in every engagement against Xiongnu cavalry across the whole of my own military service. The simple, unavoidable delay between one crossbow shot and the next, during which a mounted enemy, closing at speed, can cover a very considerable distance before our own defenders manage to reload and fire a second time. The device itself, once Han Shu had spent the better part of an afternoon studying its actual mechanical construction, proved to incorporate a genuinely ingenious solution to precisely this problem: a magazine-fed mechanism mounted atop the crossbow's main stock, capable of holding a supply of bolts that a simple, single lever-operated sliding mechanism could load, draw, and fire in rapid succession, allowing a single operator to discharge several bolts in the time that reloading a conventional single-shot crossbow would ordinarily require for just one. "This is," Han Shu said, once he had completed his initial examination and begun preparing the device for its first actual test firing, either the single most significant improvement to frontier defense that I have encountered across my entire career, or an elaborate and ultimately impractical curiosity whose theoretical advantages will not survive genuine contact with the actual demands of frontier combat. I do not believe we will know with any confidence which of these two possibilities is actually correct until we have tested it repeatedly and rigorously under conditions as close as we can practically arrange to the genuine tactical circumstances it is actually intended to address." What the testing revealed. The testing that Han Shu and his selected team of frontier soldiers conducted over the following weeks, according to the detailed reports that Commandant Zhao Feng eventually compiled and forwarded back to the Imperial Armory Administration, revealed a weapon whose actual practical performance proved considerably more complicated and considerably more genuinely instructive about the fundamental trade-offs involved in any weapon's design than either the device's original inventors or the frontier garrison's own initial expectations had fully anticipated. The repeating mechanism performs precisely as intended in terms of its basic rate of fire, Han Shu reported in one of his early written assessments prepared for Commandant Zhao Feng's own review. A trained operator can indeed discharge several bolts from this device in the time a conventional single-shot crossbow would require to fire and reload just once, representing a genuine and considerable improvement in raw rate of fire that could, in principle, prove genuinely valuable during the specific and often decisive opening moments of an engagement against rapidly closing cavalry. when the ability to deliver several successive shots before an enemy closes to melee range could meaningfully affect the engagement's overall outcome. But I must report, with equal and equally important honesty, several genuine limitations that our testing has revealed, limitations that I believe the device's original designers, working primarily within the more controlled conditions of a workshop testing environment rather than the genuine demands of actual frontier combat, may not have fully anticipated or fully accounted for in their own original design. The repeating mechanism's magazine-fed bolts of practical necessity prove somewhat lighter and somewhat shorter than the considerably heavier bolts a conventional single-shot crossbow can accommodate, resulting in a corresponding, and in our own testing, quite measurable reduction in both the weapon's effective range and its penetrating power against any genuinely armored target. Our testing further indicates that the repeating mechanism's magazine, while genuinely effective in extending the number of successive shots available before reloading becomes necessary, nonetheless does eventually require a full magazine reload once its initial supply of bolts has been exhausted. And this full magazine reload process, we have found through repeated testing, actually requires some more time to complete than the comparatively simple reload process a conventional single-shot crossbow requires between each individual shot, meaning that the repeating mechanism's genuine rate of fire advantage, while real and while potentially quite valuable during the specific opening exchange of any given engagement, does not straightforwardly translate into any comparable sustained rate of fire advantage across a longer engagement requiring several successive magazine reloads. The genuine tactical trade-off. It was in the careful, patient work of actually understanding and properly characterizing this specific trade-off between the repeating mechanism's genuine advantage in rapid, short burst rate of fire and its genuine disadvantage in individual bolt range, individual bolt penetrating power, and sustained long engagement rate of fire once magazine reloading became necessary. That Commandant Zhao Feng found himself drawn into a genuinely careful and genuinely detailed strategic analysis, one that he documented at considerable length in his own eventual formal report to the Imperial Armory Administration, and that would come in the assessment of later historians studying the broader development of ancient Chinese crossbow technology. To represent one of the more genuinely sophisticated pieces of practical weapons doctrine analysis to survive from this particular historical period. I want the Armory Administration to understand clearly, Zhao Feng wrote in the concluding section of his own formal report, that I do not believe this new repeating device should be understood or adopted as a simple wholesale replacement for our existing conventional crossbow forces, however genuinely impressive its rate of fire advantage proves during the specific and limited circumstances our testing has most favorably demonstrated. I believe, rather, based on the careful and repeated testing my own garrison has conducted across these preceding weeks, that this device represents a genuinely valuable but genuinely specialized tactical tool, whose actual value depends entirely on deploying it within the specific tactical circumstances that actually favor its particular strengths. Rather than attempting to apply it universally across every tactical circumstance our frontier forces might reasonably expect to encounter. Consider the specific tactical problem this device most directly and most effectively addresses. The brief, intense, and often genuinely decisive opening exchange of an engagement against rapidly closing cavalry, during which the ability to deliver several successive shots in rapid succession, even at somewhat reduced individual range and somewhat reduced individual penetrating power compared to our conventional single-shot crossbows, could meaningfully increase the total number of effective hits our defenders achieve against an enemy force closing the distance at speed. Before that enemy force actually reaches melee engagement range. I would recommend that this device be issued specifically to defenders positioned at the most forward and most immediately exposed defensive positions, the specific points along our fortified positions where an enemy cavalry charge is most likely to first come within effective engagement range, and where the specific tactical value of maximizing the number of successive shots delivered during that brief opening exchange most clearly outweighs the device's genuine disadvantages in sustained range and sustained penetrating power against more distant or more heavily armored targets, disadvantages that our conventional single-shot crossbows, deployed at somewhat greater distance and prepared to engage across a somewhat longer overall engagement, remain considerably better suited to address. What this teaches about weapons doctrine. It was this specific analytical approach, the careful, patient work of understanding a new weapon, not as a simple, universal improvement over existing technology, but as a specialized tool whose genuine value depended on correctly matching its specific strengths and specific limitations to the specific tactical circumstances that would actually favor its use, that a later historian of ancient Chinese military technology. Reconstructing this general period of weapons development from the surviving archaeological and textual record would come to identify as one of the more genuinely sophisticated and genuinely instructive aspects of the broader, ancient Chinese military tradition's actual practical engagement with new weapons technology. What strikes me most, studying the surviving records of this general period, a fictional but historically grounded military historian named Professor Wei Lan might reasonably observe, in a lecture addressing this specific aspect of ancient Chinese military history, is how thoroughly this kind of careful, empirically grounded, and genuinely nuanced analysis of a new weapon's actual tactical trade-offs appears. To have characterized the broader Chinese military tradition's approach to weapons development and weapons adoption across this entire historical period, in a manner that stands in genuinely instructive contrast to a considerably more simplistic and considerably less historically accurate popular assumption that new military technology, throughout most of human history, has generally been adopted or rejected based on some simple, undifferentiated assessment of whether it represents an improvement over existing technology considered in the abstract, rather than through the kind of careful, tactically specific analysis that documents like Commandant Zhao Feng's own report actually demonstrate. The repeating crossbow, as this specific historical episode illustrates, was neither wholesale adopted as a universal replacement for conventional crossbow technology, nor wholesale rejected as an impractical curiosity unable to survive genuine contact with actual combat conditions. It was instead integrated into the broader Chinese military tradition's existing weapons doctrine as a specialized tool, deployed specifically and deliberately within the particular tactical circumstances that its own particular strengths and particular limitations actually suited it for, alongside rather than in simple replacement of the conventional single-shot crossbow technology that continued throughout this same period and for many subsequent centuries. To serve as Chinese frontier forces' primary and most reliably effective ranged weapon against the specific kind of extended, longer-range engagement that the repeating crossbow's own genuine limitations rendered it considerably less well-suited to address. The deeper strategic principle. It was in considering the broader implications of this specific episode for understanding the wider Chinese strategic tradition, the same broader tradition that had, across the preceding centuries, produced the strategic writing associated with Sun Tzu, and somewhat later, the recovered treatise of his descendant Sun Bin. That Professor Wei found herself drawn to a reflection she considered genuinely significant for understanding how this broader strategic tradition's core principles actually extended into the specific and genuinely technical domain of weapons doctrine and weapons procurement, a domain that a casual reader of the more famous and more frequently quoted passages of the Sunzi tradition might not immediately associate with the text's more commonly cited strategic maxims regarding deception, terrain, and the careful management of an enemy's expectations. I would suggest, Professor Wei observed, that Commandant Zhao Feng's own careful analysis of the repeating crossbow's specific tactical trade-offs represents, in its own particular and genuinely technical domain, a direct and genuinely faithful application of one of the broader Sunzi tradition's most fundamental and most consistently emphasized principles, the insistence that genuinely effective strategic thinking requires careful, patient, and genuinely honest assessment of one's own actual capabilities and one's own actual limitations, rather than either uncritical enthusiasm for any new capabilities most favorable and most theoretically impressive characteristics, or reflexive skepticism toward any genuinely novel departure from established and familiar practice. The Sunzi tradition's famous insistence that a skilled commander must genuinely know both himself and his enemy applies, I would argue, with equal and equally important force to a commander's own honest assessment of his own weapons and his own equipment, considered not in the abstract, but in the specific, concrete tactical circumstances within which those weapons will actually be deployed and actually be required to perform. A commander who adopted the repeating crossbow uncritically, on the strength of its genuinely impressive rate of fire advantage considered in isolation, without conducting the kind of careful, patient, empirically grounded testing that Commandant Zhao Feng's own garrison actually undertook, would very likely have discovered the device's genuine limitations in range and penetrating power only in the middle of an actual combat engagement. At precisely the moment when discovering such a limitation carries the very greatest possible cost. A commander who rejected the device entirely, based on an equally uncritical and equally untested skepticism regarding any genuinely novel departure from established and familiar weapons technology, would have denied his own forces a genuinely valuable specialized tactical tool, whose particular strengths, properly understood and properly deployed within the specific tactical circumstances that actually favored them, could meaningfully improve his own force's effectiveness during precisely the kind of brief, intense, and often genuinely decisive opening exchange of close-range combat that frontier defense against rap. Idly closing cavalry so frequently and so consequentially involved. It was only through the kind of careful, patient, genuinely rigorous testing and genuinely honest analysis that Commandant Zhao Feng's own surviving report so clearly documents that his garrison arrived at what I would characterize as the genuinely correct and genuinely sophisticated conclusion that the new weapon's actual value lay not in any simple, universal judgment regarding whether it represented an improvement over existing technology, but in the careful, specific, and genuinely nuanced matching of its own particular strengths and particular limitations to the particular tactical circumstances that would actually allow those strengths to matter most and those limitations to matter least. What the archaeological record has confirmed. It was in the considerably more recent archaeological research into this general period of ancient Chinese weapons development, research that, in certain important respects, drew directly on the same broader tradition of careful physical and dimensional analysis that had earlier informed archaeologist Chen Meiling's own celebrated research into the standardized crossbow trigger mechanisms recovered from the Qin terracotta army excavation. Discussed in an entirely separate historical account concerning an earlier period of the same broader Chinese crossbow development tradition, that modern scholars have been able to substantially confirm and substantially extend the kind of practical, tactically grounded understanding of repeating crossbow technology that Commandant Zhao Feng's own ancient report had originally documented. Archaeological recoveries of repeating crossbow mechanisms and associated components from tomb sites and settlement excavations spanning several centuries of ancient Chinese history. A modern archaeologist specializing in this specific technology might reasonably explain, in a scholarly account synthesizing this broader body of research, confirm that repeating crossbow technology was indeed developed and deployed across an extended period of Chinese military history, existing alongside, rather than in simple replacement of the more conventional single-shot crossbow technology that continued to serve as the primary ranged weapon of most Chinese military forces throughout this same extended period. The specific physical characteristics of recovered repeating crossbow components, the somewhat lighter construction of their associated bolts, the specific mechanical design of their magazine feed mechanisms, are broadly consistent with the kind of tactical trade-offs that ancient textual sources, including reports of the general type this account has attributed to the fictional Commandant Zhao Feng, describe these weapons as having actually presented to the commanders and soldiers who actually employed them in genuine combat conditions. This pattern of specialized, tactically specific weapons adoption, rather than any simple wholesale replacement of established weapons technology by newer alternatives, appears, based on the broader archaeological and textual record now available to modern scholarship, to have characterized ancient Chinese military technology development considerably more consistently and considerably more thoroughly than a more simplistic popular narrative of straightforward technological progress, in which each new weapon simply and universally supersedes whatever came before it would generally suggest. This is, I would argue, a genuinely important corrective to a considerably more common and considerably less historically accurate assumption that frequently characterizes popular understanding of military technology history more broadly, not merely within the specific context of ancient Chinese weapons development. This particular body of research happens to concern a fictional reckoning at the frontier. Let us return, in the interest of illustrating this broader historical and archaeological understanding in more vivid and more immediately human terms, to Commandant Zhao Feng's own frontier garrison, and to the specific engagement necessarily reconstructed through informed historical imagination rather than any single surviving specific account, but grounded throughout in the general pattern of frontier warfare that the broader historical record for this period actually documents. That would eventually put his own garrison's careful analysis of the repeating crossbow's genuine tactical value to its first genuine test under actual combat conditions. The Xingnu cavalry raid came, as such raids typically did according to the broader historical pattern this period's frontier warfare generally followed, with relatively little advance warning. A mounted force numbering several hundred riders sweeping down from the northern steppe toward Zhao Feng's own fortified frontier position with the specific speed and specific tactical unpredictability that had across his WN preceding 2 decades of frontier command experience repeatedly demonstrated the genuine tactical difficulty that rapidly closing mounted cavalry presented to any static defensive position, relying primarily on conventional single-shot ranged weapons. Forward positions prepare the new devices Zhao Feng is imagined to have ordered. As the approaching cavalry force came within the specific range his own careful earlier testing had identified as the optimal engagement distance for the repeating crossbow's own particular tactical strengths. Conventional crossbows prepare for extended engagement at maximum effective range. We will test today whether our own careful analysis of these past several weeks proves itself correct under the genuine conditions it was always ultimately intended to address. The engagement that followed, we might reasonably imagine based on the general tactical pattern that Zhao Feng's own earlier analytical report had specifically anticipated, would have unfolded in 2 broadly distinct phases, each employing the specific weapon type whose own particular strengths that phase's own particular tactical circumstances actually favored. Conventional crossbows engaging the approaching cavalry at the greater ranges, where their superior individual range and superior individual penetrating power mattered most, followed, as the cavalry force closed to nearer range, by the repeating crossbow's own concentrated burst of rapid successive fire, delivered precisely during the brief, intense, and potentially decisive final moments before the cavalry force either broke off its charge or closed to actual melee engagement range. It is precisely this kind of careful, tactically specific integration of a new weapon's particular strengths into an existing and already sophisticated broader tactical doctrine, Professor Wei observed, reflecting on this broader pattern of historically documented frontier defense tactics, that I believe represents the single most genuinely instructive lesson this entire episode of ancient Chinese weapons development actually offers a modern reader, considerably more valuable in its own way than any single specific technical detail regarding the repeating crossbow's own particular mechanical construction. The lesson is not, ultimately, about crossbows at all, however genuinely fascinating their specific historical development undoubtedly is on its own terms. It is about the considerably more general and considerably more broadly applicable principle that genuinely effective military, and I would suggest, genuinely effective organizational, innovation rarely consists of simply and uncritically replacing established practice with whatever new capability happens to present the most immediately impressive advantage considered in isolation. It consists instead of the careful, patient, and genuinely honest work of understanding a new capability's actual and complete range of strengths and limitations, and of thoughtfully integrating that new capability into a broader existing system of practice in precisely the specific ways, and within precisely the specific circumstances, that its own particular strengths and its own particular limitations actually warrant. What later centuries did with this lesson? It is worth noting, in concluding this account, that the broader pattern of careful, tactically specific weapons integration that Commandant Zhao Feng's own analysis so clearly exemplifies would go on, according to the broader historical and archaeological record documenting subsequent centuries of Chinese military technology development. To characterize a great many further episodes of Chinese military innovation across the many subsequent centuries of that civilization's own continued military history, a pattern that later historians of Chinese military technology, including several of the specific historians whose broader research this account has already drawn upon in describing the earlier and separately documented episode of standardized Qin dynasty crossbow trigger production, have come to regard as a genuinely distinctive and genuinely consistent characteristic of the broader Chinese strategic tradition's actual practical approach to military technology across a very considerable span of that civilization's own long and continuous military history. I would suggest, Professor Wei concluded, in the final passage of her own broader account of this specific historical episode, that this pattern of careful, empirically grounded, and genuinely nuanced weapons integration represents one of the more genuinely significant and, I believe, genuinely underappreciated contributions that the broader ancient Chinese strategic and military tradition actually offers to any modern reader seeking to understand not merely the specific technical history of ancient Chinese weapons development, fascinating as that specific technical history undoubtedly is on its own terms, but the considerably more broadly applicable underlying principles of careful, rigorous, and genuinely honest strategic and technical assessment that this specific historical tradition, across so many centuries and so many specific individual episodes of documented practical application, so consistently and so instructively demonstrates. Commandant Zhao Feng's own careful, patient testing of a genuinely novel weapon, his own honest and unflinching documentation of that weapon's genuine limitations, alongside its genuine strengths, and his own thoughtful integration of that weapon into a broader and already sophisticated existing tactical doctrine, represents, I would argue, every bit as genuine and every bit as instructive an application of the broader Sunzi strategic tradition's own deepest and most enduring principles as any of the more famous and more frequently quoted battlefield stratagems that popular understanding of this broader tradition more commonly and more readily associates with it. A note on what actually happens. Repeating crossbows, employing magazine-fed mechanisms, allowing multiple bolts to be loaded and fired in rapid succession through a single lever-operated action, were a real and historically documented category of ancient Chinese weapons technology, with archaeological evidence and textual references spanning a considerable period of Chinese military history, extending from at least the Warring States period through the Han Dynasty and beyond. Surviving archaeological examples and textual descriptions indicate that these repeating crossbows generally fired shorter, lighter bolts than conventional single-shot crossbows, resulting in reduced range and reduced penetrating power in exchange for their significantly increased rate of fire. A genuine tactical trade-off that historical and archaeological evidence suggests ancient Chinese military forces generally addressed through specialized, circumstance-specific deployment rather than through wholesale replacement of conventional crossbow technology, which continued to serve as the primary ranged weapon of Chinese military forces throughout this same extended historical period. This pattern of careful, tactically specific integration of new weapons technology, alongside rather than in simple replacement of established technology, is documented across a considerable range of ancient Chinese military history, and is generally regarded by modern historians of Chinese military technology as a genuinely distinctive characteristic of that broader tradition's practical approach to weapons development and weapons doctrine. The specific characters of Commandant Zhao Feng, Han Shu, and Professor Wei Lan, along with the specific frontier garrison and specific cavalry engagement described in this account, are fictional narrative devices created for illustrative purposes, but the broader historical and archaeological facts regarding ancient Chinese repeating crossbow technology, its documented tactical trade-offs, and its historically attested pattern of specialized, rather than universal deployment, are drawn from established historical and archaeological